Welcome back. We've been talking about mandatory jail sentences for sex offenders.
Yes, we are. And Alicia from the Civil Liberties Union has something in response to what our good district attorney had to say. Alicia?
Well, District Attorney Fowle was speaking about the difficulty in obtaining convictions for a lot of these sorts of crimes, and that a lot of decisions are made along the way, whether to bring a case to trial, whether to charge a lesser crime. And that just, again, illuminates the fact that having something like a registration system based solely on the conviction really doesn't necessarily reflect the crime that was actually committed, nor, again, does it reflect the scope of the people that are out there that have committed these crimes that are not within the scope of the system. So, again, just to point out that we've got a huge gap between what someone would see on the registry and what they would conclude about someone's behavior.
Okay, so registration has its problems, but there are other ways we start talking about in terms of protecting society. Walter?
Sure. One proposal that's come up many times in the past many sessions has been residency restrictions. Many states have them. Some communities have had them over the years, where sex offenders are not allowed to live in certain areas within a certain distance of a school, a playground, or an area where children congregate. A very hotly contested issue. Some people believe that they should be kind of in areas where we can see them, if you will, and the more residency restrictions you have, the more likely you are to push people out into the hinterlands where you can't keep an eye on them. I know the legislature has addressed this many times, and I know Representative Haskell has been addressing that issue rather specifically over the past several terms.
Okay, residence restrictions, keeping convicted offenders so many feet away from schools and away from playgrounds. Good idea, bad idea? Representative.
I'd love to talk about that one. It doesn't work. That's what the studies are showing us across the country. It doesn't work. It drives people underground. Then these guys can't find them. That's a worse thing to have happen than to have them living there. And once again, when we talk about who are the people who are offending against our kids, they're the boyfriend who comes home, it's the uncle, it's granddad, and it's not necessarily the stranger who just moved into the neighborhood. So we need to make sure that when we do these things that it's going to make a difference, that it's going to matter. And when it doesn't, all we've done is make it difficult. Some communities have restrictions that only allow offenders to live on 3 streets in their whole city. And yet there are other towns that have none. How's an offender supposed to know when they're going to be disobeying the law? We already have probation officers in place who can mandate where people will and won't live. That's the way to manage it.
Lieutenant, from your perspective, are these kinds of things, as the representative said, driving people underground? Are you having a harder time keeping track of people?
I think because the City of Augusta doesn't have any ordinances that address the issue of where they can or cannot live, and more or less we follow state statutes with that there are a lot of places for them to live within the city. We're able to keep track of them and offer them services that they wouldn't get elsewhere out in the unorganized parts of the community.
Thank you. Anyone else have a thought on this topic?
I think Walt really put his finger on it in terms, I have no sympathy for these offenders, but I don't want them all moving out into the country. I live in the country, and it's best if they're closer to urban centers where services are offered and where they have organized police forces that can keep an eye on them. That's my main concern about residency restrictions.
Okay, well, let me just respond to that. You know, there are those of us who live, for instance, in Augusta or Waterville or Portland who think that perhaps the burden of this ought to be spread a little bit more, and that by congregating people together, you're actually increasing some public risk. Anybody see it that way? But at least you had your hand up about something else.
Yeah, one of our concerns is that this can create a ripple effect as well, where there is that not in my backyard, where if you see these restrictions pop up in one town and then the next town over says, well, hey, then that's going to force them all to our town. I think that's some of what Representative Haskell has talked about before and was one of the impetuses behind trying to make a uniform prohibition on these sorts of policies in the state. In addition to driving people underground, in addition to not providing services to prevent recidivism, again, it prevents that. It creates that false sense of security, where just because you have a residency restriction doesn't mean you don't have people offending against kids in your community. And it might interfere with the efforts to do public education and to try to really keep kids and families safe through other means that don't have to do with targeting and punishing convicted sex offenders.
Sure, and the legislature over the years has actually increased the potential periods of probation. And I'm sure, Rob, you've dealt with this in your practice, where offenders aren't just on probation for a couple of years. They're on probation for many, many, many years. And the more serious crimes result in multiple years of probation. So the opportunity for a probation officer to adequately assess the situation, to determine you really shouldn't live here, you can live here, and create an individualized type plan.
Right. But increasingly the sentences are longer, as Everett's pointed out. So the question is, what's happening to these people who are now going to the jail, excuse me, or to prison for a longer period of time? We all can agree that once they get out, we don't want them to reoffend. What kind of rehabilitation is going on in the correctional system? Is it enough? Sheriff Liberty, you get people who were sentenced potentially to up to a year in prison. Candidly, how much treatment is going on given the budget problems we've got?
At the correctional facility in Kennebec County, they have substance abuse, decision-making, risk-taking, GED, nothing specific for sex offenders.
We're going to have to move on now because we're drawing to the close. And what I told our panel when we started was that I'm going to ask each of them to pretend that they're king or they're queen for a minute. They can change one thing about our system and how we deal with sex offenders here in the state of Maine. What would it be? Lieutenant Reed?
I'd like to see it where each offender is taken a look at and the state does a risk assessment with them and determine whether they fall into this particular category. They're high risk, low risk, and then make a determination there whether or not to do neighborhood notifications or whether we should do any kind of more follow-ups or more restrictions on the high-risk offenders.
Thank you. Representative Haskell?
He stole my answer because moving from an offense-based system to a risk-based system is the way that we're going to be able to provide more safety for our kids and add some education in there. We need to teach kids good touch, bad touch, when to tell, all those kinds of things. So it's a very important piece to add.
Thank you. What would the Civil Liberties Union change?
We also think that this needs to be risk-based assessments. I agree as well with the public education, and I think there needs to actually be treatment and support for sex offenders, not just punishment.
Thank you. Mr. District Attorney.
As a result of the changes made in the law, sex offenses for child sex abusers and for predatory offenders have doubled in the last 5 years, at least in my district. I'd like to see them double again in the next 5 years, but at the same time maintaining the independence of the judiciary so that they can truly be the judges after hearing all of the evidence.
Thank you. Sheriff.
We need two things. We need to enhance treatment for those sex offenders that are incarcerated, so when they come out, it reduces recidivism. The second thing is we need to adequately fund the enforcement of the law enforcement officers.
That's not there now, apparently.
There is none. It was unfunded.
Thank you. Deputy?
I agree with Representative Haskell and Senator Reed that risk-based assessment is important so that people that are going to go on the list are clearly defined as being someone that's a potential threat. And also it's crucial that we follow the rest of the country and listen to the news that's going on and having the legislature in this state address those issues so we don't experience a similar tragedy that's going on all over the country. Start funding these programs. It's a priority. Deal with it.
Thank you, Deputy. And the last word to the Criminal Defense Bar.
Well, I'm going to take two last words since I'm last. One is, as I mentioned earlier, I would make sure that that we recognize that registration is a punishment to the people that are being forced to register, and that the rules that are in place when they're convicted are the rules that are going to apply to them down the road. But the other thing I think is very important is to make sure that there is enough funding, not just for law enforcement, but law enforcement and prosecution. How these cases are investigated are crucial to making sure not just that the right people are charged, but also that making sure that the wrong people are not charged. That the right investigatory tools and training can ensure that there are charges brought more often against the right offenders and that the wrong individuals, innocent individuals, aren't charged because of law enforcement and prosecution not having the tools that they need.
Thank you. I said that was the last word, but it's not quite the last word, is it, Walter?
That's right. We've got Gary Crocker, who always has the last word, who's going to tell us a little bit about sex offenders and sex offenses from his perspective.
The Wes Gardner perspective. Gary?